But there's definitely choices that you can make that are hazardous for your body and your brain. And I definitely made a lot of choices that were hazardous for my body and my brain. And I talk a lot about drugs because that's a very apparent thing. And certainly in my own career, I do hope to do some work in the field of mental health and addictions because I've been there. I've been there. And, you know, I would absolutely love to have some, you know, role to play in that atmosphere. But it's beyond that. I always talk about these pillars of health in my own life. And I was talking about this today with my new friend who will be on the show at some point that I keep mentioning. But for me, diet, exercise, sleep, and then, of course, there's the medical intervention. I will be very open about the fact that, yes, I take meds. No, I'm not big on this idea that everybody needs to go off their meds and go on this really specific diet and do all of these things. That might work for you, and if it does, great. But I know for a fact that I just don't, to be honest, I actually don't know what I would be doing right now if I wasn't on them. They're very helpful to me, and I believe that they're improving my quality of life. What I will say is that I was diagnosed with bipolar in 2017, early in 2017. This came after showing some symptoms at the end of 2016. I had really, truly, for the first time in my life, said goodbye to substances, and I've been a completely sober individual ever since. I don't even drink alcohol anymore. But when that ended, I found that with nothing to keep me down and sedate me, I was suddenly acting a bit bizarre, and I felt myself unable to control my speech, that I was talking too much and too fast, and I felt like I didn't want to speak anymore, but it wasn't stopping. And I felt like I wanted to sit down, but couldn't sit. I was very agitated, very fidgety all of the time, and once again, that when I began this journey of better health, I really chalked all of it up to anxiety. I didn't really think much else of it. But I did have some behaviors that, while not delving into the very risky category that I had been in before, were definitely a bit impulsive and a bit risky. So I was very open about this to a few friends of mine, and one very good friend of mine who was taking a lot of psychology courses at the time was like, "Hey, Annie, I can't help but notice these couple things, and maybe you ought to mention it at your next appointment, because I do see the doc every 4 to 6 weeks." So I made a note of it, and I did think he had a good point. I wasn't, denying that there was probably something funky going on in my brain. I've always known that there have been issues, and you can't really rely too heavy on diagnoses made when you're 14. Our bodies are changing, our brains are changing, that's just a fact. Our brains change throughout our whole lifetime. What happens to you 10 years ago, and what happens to you now, and 5 or 10 years from now is totally different. And it's not just our mindset. It's truly our makeup. It's just down to the level of our neurons. Everything is always changing. So I go to my doctor, I tell him all these things, and we go through a waiting period of seeing if it goes away by this date, and seeing if it goes away by this date, and maybe if I eliminate this, and if I try this, and if I try this again. And of course, it just seemed to persist. So it was kind of figured out at that moment that that's my issue. And I really didn't want to go on meds. I really did not. I was so anti-med. I cannot express to you enough how anti-med I was. And I was always on Google looking up how to treat bipolar 2 without meds. I remember, I used to be tired in the middle of the day. I went through a period after my first episode of hypomania where I was incredibly depressed. I had my first true bipolar depressive episode. I'd been depressed a million times, but not quite like this. And so I was always tired, and I still, when I have my depressive month or 2 or 3, I always experience this where I have a really good couple hours from maybe 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And then around 3, it starts to go down a bit, and then by 4 is bedtime. Which is really bad because 4 o'clock in the afternoon is not bedtime for anybody. And so I would kind of come home from doing my few things around, and my mother would say, you should really take a nap. And I'd be like, no, I can't take a nap. I read on Google, I read on some website that, bipolar people shouldn't take naps. And I don't know whether that's true or not. Something about it disrupting the sleep cycle, and it's already kind of out of whack, and it shouldn't be tampered with, and all of this stuff. So, I really didn't want to mess with it at all. And I was really desperate. I was trying to look up dietary changes that I can make. And I'm sure that there are things that I still don't know about natural approaches. And I'm very open to that. And we might hear a bit about that from Richard, who I met today. Because that's his focal point, primarily. But for me, when I finally did make that decision, it was at the urging of a couple of very close friends. That decision to say, okay, I'm going to give it a try. It was the best decision I ever made. And I had a friend tell me, listen, do it for 30 days, 1 month, just give it a try. If it doesn't work, just wean yourself off. To tell the doctor you don't want it. And get yourself off and just try something else. And so I went into it with that mindset of I can always stop if it doesn't work. And, you can't really go into meds with what's the worst that can happen, because you don't want to go there. There are plenty of unfortunate things that can happen. But I always knew that, I could stop. If I wanted, this would not be forced upon me, and I could say, this treatment isn't working. So I was assigned this med, and I went in specifically. I was still losing weight, and, you hear a lot of drugs for bipolar disorder cause weight gain. I was terrified of that. So I said to my doctor, hey, I'm losing weight. I cannot stop losing weight and gain. And so there was one drug that he had for bipolar that didn't cause weight gain, and in fact some people lost a couple pounds. And luckily for me, it worked. Did it cure my depression? Absolutely not. It did not. But did it help me get through the day? Did it give me an extra hour or two? And the rest of the hours of that day, I wasn't completely exhausted? Yes. I even found an improvement in some of the pain issues that I was having, where I would wake up sore all over. And that was alleviated for the first time in a couple months. Of course, I've also noticed with myself that under high-stress situations, things tend to kind of snap, and I kind of move into another state. And so if I'm depressed, that can end under high stress, and it kind of synced up that way with me this year as well. But when I went on meds, it was an absolute godsend for me, and it changed my life. However, I think, going back to my point of all these pillars of health, I think that it's an integral part of it for sure, but there are other aspects of that as well. And I believe that if I stopped going to the gym tomorrow, that my mental health would crumble. And I think that if I started, just eating fast food again, and if I personally was to go back to eating meat, I don't think that would be good for me. The last few times that I have eaten meat, I felt incredibly sluggish after doing so. So I know for a fact that if I ignore my fitness, my mental health deteriorates. If I ignore the dietary changes that I've made, my mental health deteriorates. Sleep, very important. I cannot stress that enough. And I couple sleep with stress management techniques, because they're both related. Well, I don't know how related sleep is to cortisol. It's all hormonal. I know that sleep definitely is good for the growth hormone and has restorative properties. But once again, if you're doing stress management, you're also kind of keeping yourself in balance, and I think that sleep is a really important part of that. So yeah, balance with the movement, balance with the eating, but within ourselves, we have to create that balance. How can we expect a medication to bring us to this state of perfect balance? If our lifestyle is completely off kilter, and if we're not sleeping, I know that for a lot of people, going a few days sleep deprived can trigger mania in people. So my relationship with my bipolar has been, it's a new relationship, because I was very unaware of it because of the situations in my life, but It's been quite a transition. So now that I've talked about my journey to diagnosis, it's about time to talk about my getting better to some extent, and I say my breaking and mending brain because this is all a work in progress, and I consider bipolar disorder to be a chronic illness that I know that I'll be treating for the rest of my life. But before I go into that, it is half past. So it is time to take our second and final break of the hour, but Annii Gets Healthy will be right back after these important messages. Welcome back to Annii Gets Healthy, the show where we talk health, wellness, nutrition, physical activity, sleep. Now, today we've been talking about mental health and my mental health. I will say again, if you want to have a conversation with me about anything discussed on this show, or you have an idea for a future episode and you really want to hear me talk about something, or if you think I'm totally wrong about something and you want to challenge me, I encourage you to reach out to me on Instagram at Annii Gets Healthy. That's ANNII Gets Healthy. Reach out to me there. I really do encourage people to challenge me. I like having my opinions questioned because it makes me reevaluate things and see, am I really in the right here? Am I living my best life? Am I doing the best I can for myself or to anybody who listens to this show? So, and I made this point in the first episode, I would much rather that people call what I say into question and challenge me and, engage in that dialogue with me than just completely shy away from talking about health. I think here in Newfoundland we're a little opposed to talking about health. It makes us uncomfortable. It's part of our culture. A lot of the parts of our culture kind of feed into some of these problems. And, and I was talking about this earlier, just on a quick tangent before we go back to the topic at hand, that my mother is, ever since, I stopped eating a lot of the meat and everything, telling me that I'm not a real Newfoundlander. And once again, I always make the argument that, the Newfoundland stereotype contains a lot of unsavory things. And, if I were to meet the stereotype, I probably wouldn't be too healthy at all, now would I? So once again, we have to be able to challenge all of that, and it can be hard. We are set in our ways. I know I was. And it's nothing that happens overnight, for sure. It's baby steps. And, showing baby steps to the people around you can maybe inspire them to make a change as well. But at the end of the day, it's about being comfortable where you're at and being willing to push yourself a little bit, but not doing anything unreasonable, or else it just won't be sustainable. So, as I said, this is the part where I stopped talking about how everything was horrible and my life was going down the drain. I was tired and I was losing all of this, important time in my life, and moving into really what I do to keep myself well now. And I talked about those 4 pillars, but I'm going to get real specific. I talked in the first episode about these feelings of anxiety kind of triggering this lifestyle change for me. And so I really attributed it to too much caffeine, and to a lesser extent too much sugar, but I didn't really know the real danger of typical sugar consumption, so I didn't really think much of that aspect. The biggest culprit in that for me was soda. It's very common to have a soda or 2 per day, and I hate to break it to you, but those diet sodas, they're not helping you any. They're really not. No calories does not mean good for you. I promise you that. For me, I was able to get a bit of distance between the soda and me, and I cut out, as I said in the first episode, I cut out juice, I cut out milk. I just, for a little period, and it was a long period actually, I drank nothing but water. I was off the caffeine because I figured that was the problem. Caffeine, in my opinion now, is something that you shouldn't overdo. And once again, if you have a mental health issue and you're on, certain psychiatric medications, you may not be able to drink coffee at all. When I had a bit of distance from those beverages and that sugar intake was really coming down, I did find a bit of relief in my workday. That's why I continued. And I was thinking that, is there some link here between the sugar? And so as time went on and I was cutting out some of these, not cutting out, but really limiting some of these starches as well, and I was noticing this effect becoming better. And so that's the first big thing about how I treat my mental health, is I'm real selective with how I take in sugar. with how I take in carbohydrates.